Bravo.
I wish I could sing. I actually come from a musical family, but I was the one guy in the family that didn't get the genes for being able to sing. That is a pretty amazing rendition of what the situation actually is. And I'll try. It's going to be hard to follow, but I'll do my best here. So, stating the problem. I mean, first of all, I know nothing about opera really, so I assume that there was some fidelity to opera. But it is a fact. Even at the FDA, we say we don't think our job is done. We need more evidence. First of all, just to make better decisions in the first place about what goes on the market and when. And also because our mandate by law is to write labels that actually are instructive to people on how to use products in the practice of medicine. We don't regulate the practice of medicine, but we regulate the products. And right there in our mission statement, part 3 of our mission statement is to write instructions that are understandable, that enable people to use products safely and effectively. And then one of the great joys actually of my job in the months that I've been here has been working with Andy Slavitt and Patrick Conway and the team at CMS. And as you all know, they're between 30 and 40% now in terms of CMS payments that are not traditional fee-for-service. And it's a stated policy of the administration to get over the 50% mark as soon as possible. And a wide-scale view that as that happens, it's going to tilt things so that the rest of the ecosystem adjusts in a way that we hope will be very favorable for filling in this gap that my colleague has so entertainingly pointed out. And so, I think we certainly feel like the current system of evidence generation is not doing the job. We've got, and I'll just add to it, over the last month, the things that I've seen that are things in the technologies in the pipeline are, I don't think people yet realize how profound the technology revolution is right now. And it's, the easy one to point to now is gene editing. And by the way, there's Nancy Myers who's here sent me a clip of an a cappella rendition of gene editing that when you look at it, you actually learn from it because it's so entertaining in and of itself. But I had basically a week where I had a full briefing on plants, a full briefing on animals, and a full briefing on humans, and the implications of gene editing and where it actually is. And probably all you really need to know how close it is that high school students in Bethesda at science fairs for $300 are doing science projects with gene editing in plants. And doing it in people technologically is not that different. Now, doing it safely and effectively, that's the question that we've all got to address. So the current system's not doing what it needs to do, and we're in this explosive period of technologies where the demands on the system are going to be greater. And before people do feel like it's a tragic opera, I don't think that's the case. It's actually pretty exciting because the fact is we're doing better than we ever have. Life expectancy for almost everyone is continuing, except for people like me. We've learned now is getting better every year. So we're doing well compared to the past, but now it's time to really step it up. So this is not a message of things are terrible. It's a message that things are good, but I think the next revolution in science is really going to be about data sharing. Probably the most profound thing that can happen because so many other areas are moving so quickly. If we don't do that, we're not going to take advantage of everything else. So this has been, my key slide for years, and I doubt if anyone would argue with this. In a rational world, we would boil down all of this massive basic and translational science into the few things that actually work. And just to remind everybody, in the latest reports that we saw, it's still the case that more than 90% of drugs, for example, that get into phase 1 don't make it to the market. 3 big reasons: they either don't work like people thought they would, they have unexpected toxicities, or it turns out you can't manufacture the product in a reliable way. And so the failure rate is still profound, and we need a good system that winnows out the failures as quickly as possible. But with the ones that look like winners, then we have a huge amount of work to do the right clinical trials to understand how to help doctors and patients know what they should do in a complex world using clinical practice guidelines and other methods. Here I'll just point out, one example that I live with every day now is, most Americans also do, is opioid problems, and we have the best there is. The clinical practice guidelines from the CDC is something that we all agree should be used, but of the 13 big recommendations, 0 for 13 have a high level of evidence. So it's just one of many examples I could point to. And as we think about how to implement things in our changing healthcare systems, understanding what works and then measuring as it's implemented what happens is another rapidly evolving area. And I think the bottom line is I'll go through for what I think a lot of the federal agencies are now thinking is that for any part of this, except for the very early clinical trials, which need to be done in a very special environment, the more that we can do in the real world of clinical practice, the better the system is going to be at yielding results that are good for people's health. And the fundamentals we're going to talk about today would apply regardless of where in the cycle you are, except for the early part of translation. But we're not in such great shape now, and we spent a good bit of time at FDA with the support of all the other HHS agencies and the Department of Defense and the VA. And by the way, it is an entertaining part of the job after hearing for years about how hard it is for federal agencies to work together to see that that actually is true, especially when you go across cabinet level entities. Just to get sign off on a manuscript can take dozens of people and months to years to get done. But I think we've done it. But with their support, we've been investigating what's going on out there, and this slide that I made up a few years ago, I think is still true. If you go out and talk to people in practice who are the frontline people that need to get research done, it's a system that they don't find very attractive right now, and we need to do something about it. And in the latest returns from this original paper that one of our fellows wrote in my academic life, we're not doing much better than the 15% of major clinical practice guidelines for the major specialties being based on high quality evidence. So with all the money that's being spent, all the work that's being done, we're just barely scratching the surface of what we need to know with the current system. And if that's not bad enough, this may be the only industry on the face of the earth right now which appears to be getting less efficient over time. And this is happening when we got all these tools of automation and big data and everything at our disposal, but the cost of doing clinical trials is continuing to skyrocket. And I'm sure during the course of the day there'll be much discussion about why this is and what should be done about it. But we have some ideas about what we think should be done. And the fundamental idea is something that Greg, I'm sure, identifies with. It's just the fundamental concept that now that we're collecting data in clinical practice, and it's all digital, it's all shareable, the technology is not the issue. We've got to take advantage of that to move the system to a much more efficient model to answer these questions that are critical for people to make the right decisions about their health and healthcare. And it should be embarrassing to us, I think, in healthcare that other major industries have already done this. So, if you look at Google or Amazon or Walmart, the dominant players, they'll all tell you the reason they're dominant is that this is what they do. When you shop in their environments, everything about what you do is recorded. And no matter where you are in the world, the information goes to an analytical center that is constantly running algorithms. And their dependent variables, of course, is how much money do you spend, and are you satisfied with the shopping experience? Hopefully we have different dependent variables, although sometimes you wonder when you look at the way our healthcare systems are currently configured. But if our dependent variable is how long do you live and how functional you are and how much are you enjoying your healthcare experience, or how much do you not hate it, well, it might be another way to look at it, assuming that none of us really want to go to the doctor unless we have to. And so as we think about this, we came up with a set of slides that, I mean, most of you have heard me say this before, but a transforming moment for me was the roadmap of 2002. And there was a guy named Steve Strauss, who many of you in the room knew. He unfortunately died of a brain tumor, but he ran an institute at NIH. And as he looked at what we were describing with Dr. Zarhuni at the time, trying to anticipate what the future would be for clinical research, the driving concept for us was that there would be a point when 300 million Americans had electronic health records. At the time, almost nobody did in 2002, if you remember back to that point. And those who did had clunky little systems that basically worked for an individual practice maybe, or part of a hospital, and that was it. And then you said, well, how could we really have the system of the future? And the answer was almost certainly not this. And Steve actually made up the slide. This is a traditional model of doing research. If it's industry-funded research, it might be a company with a CRO or a company itself. The research sites out there are basically supplicants of the funder who runs the coordinating center. This, by the way, was great for my academic career. I figured this out when I was really young and realized that if you ran the coordinating center, you had the data so you could write all the papers. It was great for me, but now that I'm older, I would like to change it, of course. So, you know, and it's been fascinating to me when you look at how quality of clinical research sites is defined. It's basically been defined as how well do you follow orders that come from whoever is the coordinating center. And I don't think that's a very enticing model for people that have spent 16 years of postgraduate education and are experts in their field to say, my sign of quality is that I follow someone else's orders who may not know as much about the disease as I do. So what Steve said, and this is his slide 2, was, you know, data is going to be electronic, so what we need to do is create a model that's more collaborative and interactive. So this is 2002. And at the time, because it was unimaginable that data could really flow in the way that it can now, it was sort of just a modification on the old model, but also the concept that the insanity of envisioning a clinical trial, writing a protocol, going out and finding a bunch of research sites that are all independent of each other, writing a contract with each one, going through 100 IRBs, assembling your study team, then going out and trying to find the patients, get your study done, write it up, and then close everything down until the next trial comes along and then start all over again. Just didn't make sense. And so the idea was that we needed a network. And a lot of this thinking is what led to the CTSA organization, which I'll get back to later. But then along came Kaiser and several other systems in particular. But today you could put in Inova here in this area. You could put in Hopkins. You could put in Duke, my former place. You could put in UCSF. American healthcare now, as you all know, is rapidly consolidating. It's continuing. And independent clinics are essentially going away. They're all owned by some corporate entity, usually not-for-profit, but you know, it's a mixture of profitability, but they all essentially behave the same as best I can see. The good part of it is you now begin to have the ability to share information to optimize your system, and that's going to be driven by the payment mechanisms that I mentioned already. The potential bad part is if you put that same system with the wrong dependent outcome, you may not improve health, you may just affect profitability. But the key concept, much like Walmart or Amazon, is that you have all these hospitals and practices which now have the same corporate owner. They're putting data in, but of course the important thing is that they get analytics back that help them practice better and more efficiently. And this is the work I think that's fundamentally in process. It's the only way we can envision that the system can actually be transformed to a more efficient model. working at the margins of making study monitoring better, that's a good thing to do, for example, but it's not going to fix the fundamentals of how the economics of evidence generation work. And so we're now pretty far along, and actually, as we've worked on this, across all the federal agencies, we're much further along than I thought we were. So in this model, if you now say, well, we got a bunch of people across the United States that all have electronic records of multiple types. They're all interested in better knowledge. They're highly compelled to make their data and information better because they need it to run their health systems. And if the payment mechanisms begin to reward better health outcomes instead of just how many widgets you make, if we can create mechanisms to share the data, then almost regardless of your question, the data should be amazingly less expensive because it's already there. You don't have to recreate it, which is a huge part of the cost of the current clinical trials system. So in the case of device surveillance, we've announced now that the Nest is for real. That is a device surveillance system, which is really being built from scratch on the back of the great work with Sentinel on the drug side, but with the idea all along that it's a network. It's not one thing. And so if there's a device question, you should be able to connect up with these systems of multiple clinics working together and ask a device-specific question. I'll just mention one thing along the way is we got to have device identifiers in the system, which I think we're finally winning the battle to make that happen after many years of effort. But if you had drug surveillance or drug trials as your issue, it really shouldn't look a whole lot different because once you know who the patients are, what their major diagnoses are, what their outcomes are, there are things that you can add to the system for the specific questions that you have, and there may be special issues in the coordinating center needs to know, but you can call upon the systems that are interested in this. And one big change is it's not individual clinics now, it's really systems because they do have corporate owners and mechanisms that they report in. And if your question is post-market clinical trials or observational data or comparative effectiveness, PCORI is well along in working this. I know we'll hear about all these later on today. So the key points in this right now, where we are today from the FDA perspective, and this very much work in progress, and it's been a lot of fun to have access to so many smart people and resources as we work through this. Related to today, and you can just read Greg and Steve's paper, which came out a couple of days ago. I think it's pretty much all in there as far as I'm concerned, but a really fundamental, and we have a series of writings to come out from the FDA about this that are, many of them are in press now. So the first is, it's really critical from our perspective to not confuse real-world evidence and experimental design, because we keep hearing people posit the two as polar opposites. Like you can't have real-world evidence and randomization. It's either or. Well, in fact, it's quite the opposite. The source of the data and what your population is, that's one aspect, that's one vector in understanding study design. The other is what's your fundamental experimental design. And we believe, and this is across the FDA, that the highest form of the art is going to be randomization in the context of the real world. As I say, except in the case of very early studies where you need to do randomization in a very special study setting that's separate from the real world because you're giving new things to people that people have never experienced before, and you've got to have a very intensive environment. And then in addition to that, there's nothing in current FDA regulations or guidance about the so-called evidence standard. And I say so-called just because it's been interesting to me to see how many different views about what the evidence standard is there are within the FDA and outside the FDA. But in no way does the standard or the regulations and guidance that relate to it prohibit or inhibit the use of real-world evidence when real-world evidence is appropriate in the views of competent experts in the field, which is what the regulation actually says. And so, and in that context, the experimental design is another issue. So I know Mark Berger is going to hold forth about where he thinks things are, and I don't think we're very far apart. In fact, I think we're in the same place. But if you came in and said, we've got real-world evidence and it's crappy data, lousily collected, we had no design, we've asked 1,000 questions and we found one with a significant p-value, of course, that's not going to meet an evidence standard. But if you came in, there are just 100 variations on that theme that would be highly useful. In our view right now, the leavening factor is the use of randomization. But I think Mark will make the case that with some bells and whistles, that doesn't have to be the case, and that's a fertile area for discussion. But there is no regulation or guidance that says you can't use real-world evidence. The next thing is, in work with CMS, we've really come to the place where we believe, except for those early studies, we should have a common source of evidence. It's right that we have different criteria for our decisions. The decision about what should be allowed to go on the market or be labeled should be different than the decision about what gets reimbursed and for whom it gets reimbursed. But fundamentally, the best clinical trial evidence, what gets on the market, would give you the change in outcome for the new therapy compared to the old. And if you have a good clinical trial, you can also measure the difference in resource use. It's a pretty fundamental issue. Now, the problem that we're dealing with, which is also not a bad thing, and I have relatives who have benefited from this, with the ability we have now at FDA to be flexible about letting things on the market more quickly when there's not an effective treatment, and it's promising, without all the data you would need to calculate resource use difference, we've got this gap that Greg alluded to, which actually gets bigger if you have an accelerated approval, and we have to figure out how to fill in that gap. Third thing is, as the evidence system changes, consensus about substantial evidence and quality for different purposes, or that is quality of the research, what we call quality by design, is going to be critical. And I'm not proposing that any of us know the right answer to this, because the world is changing fast. But sticking to the old model is a recipe for an escalating cost at a time when we need more efficient research, because the questions are far outnumbering our ability to answer them. And then one that, it's a paper I'm planning to write, but it still amazes me that we have to write it. But everywhere I go, even in very learned groups, this thing about doctors know from experience which treatments work. It just seems to be impossible to get this out of even medical school training. And, for someone who grew up in treating heart attacks and seeing that, about 95 out of the 100 things that we tried in the heyday of big clinical trials in cardiology, everybody says, that was great in the good old days, you did these great trials. People forget that most of what we tried didn't work. And if we had gone by what doctors thought, we would have 95% of the treatments for heart attack would be either ineffective or frankly dangerous that are out there. And so we've got to come up with a way to explain this to people so they really get it. But I'm seeing this everywhere I go. There's a big resurgence of this kind of thinking again. And then the big stick in the mud, which I'm counting on you guys to solve today, is we feel like the data is just going to get better and better. We're sort of at a tipping point. It's not going to get worse. The forces are in motion. We're going to have all kinds of problems, so it's going to get better and better. The real fundamental problem is that doctors and other healthcare providers are telling us that they don't have time to engage people in prospective research. And just collecting observational data is not going to be sufficient for a large part of what we need. And we've got to solve this problem together. All right, so what are we doing at the federal level? And like you, I suspect, I have not read the entire ACA, and I don't plan to. It's many, many pages. But what I learned when we started working on this project is that we are actually required by law. Congress passed a law that told us that we need to work across federal agencies to create a data system that works for the country. And there's been a large amount of work well before I got to the FDA in the background, and I think John White will tell you about some of it. And we did find that every single federal agency has at least one big project trying to create data in its sphere and make it available both for federal purposes but also for public purposes. This is just a list of some of the things that were going on. The question now is, how do we create connections among all these big projects? Because if you, for example, combine the 200 million people whose prescription data and major outcomes we have in Sentinel with the CMS enclave for other kinds of outcomes and the prospective nature of the NIH collaboratory, you end up with a very rich data source that I would argue is probably going to be better than study nurses trying to collect data prospectively for long-term outcome studies. So that's what we're working on. And we have 5 key issues we think need to be addressed. Numbers, well, I'll say we have 10, but numbers 1 through 5 are this one. We've got to figure out how to organize operational systems. The systems are in place. They are operational, but learning in practice doesn't seem to be one of the fundamental attributes that's being valued right now. And so we've got a list of sort of subtitles in there of subjects that we're working on to try to figure out. But this is the one that we think is the biggest issue. Robust framework for privacy, confidentiality, and security. And, you know, I'll just say, and John may have more to say about this, but I'm of two minds about this now. The most important one is I think the Precision Medicine Initiative, with tremendous amount of work by the Office of Civil Rights and many other federal agencies, I think is a great framework for this. But let's face it, we're also in an era now where assuming that any of your electronic data is totally secure, if the Russians have John Podesta's emails, I mean, it's not right to assume. But the alternative of saying we're going to go back to the system where little fragments of data exist in every doctor's office, it's just not a reasonable alternative. So I think the framework that Precision Medicine Initiative have is really as good as it gets for now, but we're going to have to keep working on it. This is the one that I think we're just well on the way because there's so many people working on it. It's getting better and better, and it'll be interesting to hear today about where people think they are in their efforts. But we have every intention at the federal level to take advantage of the billions of dollars invested already in things like PCORI, the NIH Collaboratory, just the electronic health record system, $51 billion of taxpayer money to make the data better and better so that we can generate evidence at a much faster rate. And we do need continued methods development. I know there'll be discussion about that today. Everything doesn't need a randomized trial. We all agree with that. But we would also hold out that naive views that you don't need randomization at all are just not going to cut it. So, we need to take advantage. I call it God's gift of randomization. Because it clarifies so many things. And even recently, I've had to be involved in some very tough issues at the FDA when people get convinced that they can't be on placebo, for example, and you end up with trials that just don't give you definitive information and very confused views about what should be done. And then in the midst of all this, rather than the work resulting in more and more elaborate, expensive, and inefficient systems, we need to always keep in mind the work ought to be focused on a more efficient system. And I don't know why this industry in particular has gotten into the shape it's in, but that's what's happened in my view. Everyone that wants to add a bell and a whistle or an ornament on the Christmas tree, and you end up with this gaudy thing that basically doesn't work. Now, the next 2 slides are not to make any particular point, but we've gone through all these systems and asked the question, how far along are we for a number of use cases that range all the way from population-level insights into antibiotic usage and resistance to real-world data for efficient clinical trials and everything in between. And you can just see from the amount of circles that are filled in that we're not that far away. And I think we've really come to believe that. And if you look at the systems that are in play across the federal agencies, but all of them involving private partners in one way or another, we're not talking about a top-down federal single system. We're really talking about a federation of entities that can work together under a set of rules that allow for sharing of data to answer questions efficiently. So if we had a more efficient evidence generation system, much more clinical practice could be guided by high-quality evidence, and I'm increasingly seeing that major policy decisions might actually be rational, which is a hard thing to come by right now, because when you don't have evidence, everyone has an opinion, and the person that argues the loudest or is in the biggest position of power tends to win. And clinicians and practice organizations could focus on interpreting the evidence and applying it rather than spending all their time trying to figure out how to get control of the evidence. And then the role of opinion and expertise would be put into place where it really can make a difference, which is in this evolving concept of precision medicine. So, I will say one of the more exciting parts of this job is to spend time with the president. He's on a wave of popularity now, which has been good for me, but between the president with his real love for precision medicine and understanding that we got to break down the data silos that currently exist, and the vice president totally driven now for the cancer moonshot, which will give us a wedge where there's a lot of popular support to accomplish a lot of these things, even with 94 days to go. That's what we have. I still think there's a lot that can be accomplished with momentum to go into the future. So that's sort of a look at where we are. As I look at the rest of the agenda, I'm pleased I'm actually able to stay for a good part of the morning, and I'm really excited to hear where people think we are in regard to this picture, but we're very excited about it. So thanks, and I look forward to the rest of the meeting.